In the very middle of one of the worst droughts in its entire history, with its reservoirs shrinking, and its farms drying up, and its cities all being told to save every single drop of water that they possibly could, the state of California went and did something that, at first, sounds almost completely insane. Because it took one of its single largest reservoirs, a body of water big enough to supply a full million people for an entire year, and it deliberately and very nearly completely drained it, on purpose. And then it kept it that way, nearly empty, for years on end. But it was not a mistake. And it was not mismanagement. In fact, it was very nearly the single most responsible decision that the state could possibly have made. Because that reservoir was being held back by an aging dam, one sitting directly on top of an earthquake fault that had quietly become far, far too dangerous to fill. This is the strange and the genuinely important story of the Anderson Dam. Subliva 45. Before we go any further, if this is exactly the kind of story you came here for, take just 1 second to subscribe. A lot of folks watch these all the way to the end and simply forget to, and it genuinely helps this channel keep making them. Alright, let's begin. So let's start with what Anderson Dam actually is, because it is very much not some small or forgotten little structure. Because Anderson Dam sits up in the hills near the city of Morgan Hill, right in the very heart of California's Santa Clara Valley, the region far better known to the entire world by another name, Silicon Valley. And it was built all the way back around 1950, as a huge earthen dam standing some 240 feet tall and holding back the single largest reservoir in the whole county. And that reservoir, Anderson Lake, can hold around 90,000 acre-feet of water, which is a genuinely enormous amount. To put that into real human terms, it is enough water to supply around 1 million people for a full year. And it makes up more than half of all the water storage capacity of the entire local water district, a district that serves close to 2 million people. In other words, Anderson Dam is genuinely not just important to the region's water supply. It is absolutely central to it. It is, quite simply, the single most important piece of water infrastructure in all of Silicon Valley. But there is a very, very serious problem with Anderson Dam, and it is, above all, a problem of its location. Because the dam was built all those many decades ago in one of the single most seismically active places on the entire planet. Because California, as you very likely already know, is absolutely riddled with earthquake faults. And Anderson Dam sits within just 3 short miles of one of the truly big ones, the active Calaveras Fault. And in fact, it is even worse than that, because studies have since found that fault lines actually run directly beneath the dam itself. And when engineers went back, in more recent years, and very carefully studied exactly how this old 1950s-era earthen dam would actually hold up in the event of a truly major earthquake, they very much did not like what it was that they found. Because their assessments concluded that a large enough quake, something in the range of magnitude 7, or even greater, could very well cause the entire dam to fail. Commentaries that I'm genuinely curious as we go. Did you have any idea that a major reservoir had been deliberately emptied like this? Or is this the first you're hearing of it? Let me know down in the comments. And where you're watching from, I read them all, and honestly, they often decide what I dig into next. And a failure of Anderson Dam would be a genuine and an absolute catastrophe. Because if that dam were ever to give way while its reservoir was full, it would release a colossal and a completely uncontrolled wall of water. One that engineers have specifically warned could come racing straight down into the valley below, flooding the city of San Jose, all the way down toward the distant shores of Monterey Bay. We are talking, here, about the potential flooding of one of the single most densely populated and one of the most economically vital regions in all of America. And the sheer scale of that potential disaster is almost genuinely hard to fully grasp. And it could all unfold in a matter of just a few short hours, following a major earthquake, which is to say exactly the kind of major earthquake that California knows with absolute and total certainty will one day happen again. And it is worth understanding exactly why an old earthen dam like this one is so uniquely vulnerable to an earthquake in the first place. Because a dam like Anderson is genuinely not made of solid concrete at all. It is, in its essence, really just a gigantic and a very carefully engineered mound of packed earth and rock. And when the violent shaking of a truly major quake passes right through such a structure, it can do several genuinely dangerous things to it. Because it can cause the packed earth of the whole embankment to slump, and to settle, and to crack. And in the very worst cases of all, It can even cause the water-saturated soil within it to temporarily begin to behave almost exactly like a liquid, in a genuinely terrifying process that is known as liquefaction, which can then cause whole sections of the dam to simply slide and to give way entirely. And there is an even more direct danger here too, because with a fault line running directly beneath the dam itself, a major rupture along that very fault could physically tear the entire foundations of the structure apart, right from below. And any single one of these failures, in an earthen dam holding back quite that much water, could very, very quickly indeed become completely catastrophic. And so, the people who were responsible for the dam found themselves facing a genuinely agonizing dilemma, because, on the one hand, they had a critically important reservoir, one holding the vital water supply for a truly huge population in a state that is chronically and desperately short of water, and that is frequently gripped by severe and punishing drought. But on the other hand, they had an aging dam that, in a major earthquake, could very well fail, and in doing so, could kill an unknown number of the people living downstream of it. And the more carefully that they studied it all, the clearer the only real answer became, because safety in the end simply had to come first. And so at first, beginning all the way back in 2009, regulators ordered that the reservoir could no longer ever be filled all the way up at all, that its water level had to be kept well below the very top of the dam in order to reduce the risk. But then, in 2020, they went very much further still, because federal regulators ordered the reservoir to be lowered almost the entire way down, essentially to be drained completely. And so ever since that time, this absolutely enormous reservoir, this genuinely vital store of water, enough for a full 1,000,000 people, has been held at just around 3% of its total capacity, which is to say, very nearly empty. And all of this was happening, remember, right in the middle of some of the very driest years in all of California's recorded history, at a time when the state so desperately needed every single last drop of water that it could possibly manage to store. It was, in the very truest sense of the phrase, a genuinely terrible choice, one made between two directly competing and both absolutely vital needs, water on the one side and safety on the other, and quite correctly in the end, safety won. And the sheer painful irony of the timing is worth sitting with for a moment, because California's climate does not simply do drought, it does whiplash. It swings violently between years of punishing dryness and years of sudden overwhelming wetness, when great atmospheric rivers sweep in off the Pacific and dump staggering amounts of rain across the state in just a few days. And these are exactly the years when a reservoir like Anderson would normally be worth its weight in gold, catching and storing all of that precious floodwater to be saved for the dry years to come. But instead, through those very wet years, the reservoir has had to sit there, nearly empty, and largely unable to do its job, with much of that water it might have captured simply flowing on past and out to sea. It is a genuinely maddening situation, a state whipsawing between too little water and too much of it, with one of its greatest reservoirs sidelined through all of it. And there has been a further and a quieter cost too, because the very act of draining the reservoir and of sending all that water down the creek below has done real harm to the local environment, threatening the fish, including protected steelhead trout, and the other wildlife that had come to depend upon that water downstream. There has, quite simply, been no part of this that has come without a genuine and a painful price. Now, you might at this point very reasonably ask, well, why not simply go and fix the dam, quickly, and then just refill the reservoir? And the answer to that question really reveals just how genuinely enormous a challenge repairing a major dam actually is. Because you simply cannot ever just patch over a fundamental problem like this one. Because in order to make Anderson Dam safe enough to reliably withstand a truly major earthquake, engineers ultimately determined that the entire old dam essentially has to be taken completely apart, and then rebuilt almost entirely from the ground up, like Chartier, around 5 o'clock. Quick one before we continue. If someone in your family or a friend would find this genuinely fascinating, please do send it their way. That word of mouth is honestly how a channel like this one grows. And if it's been worth your time so far, a quick like really does help the next person find it too. And this has since become one of the single largest and one of the most genuinely complex dam safety projects in the entire country. Because the plan is to remove and then to completely rebuild the enormous earthen dam entirely, carefully constructing a brand new and a fully seismically resilient embankment, built up tier by tier and specifically designed to survive the very most powerful earthquake that the site could ever realistically face. And it also involves boring a massive new tunnel straight through the hillside, in order to give operators far, far better control over the water level in the future, so that they can actually lower it quickly in an emergency, which is something the old dam simply could not ever adequately do. And it involves building a huge new spillway, too, to safely handle any major floods. And the total cost of all of this is genuinely staggering. An estimated $2.5 billion, and quite possibly even more than that. And the timeline for it all is just as sobering. Because even after many years of careful planning and of preliminary work, the main construction is only really now at last getting fully underway. And the reservoir itself is now not expected to be fully restored to its total capacity until around the year 2032. Which means that this genuinely vital reservoir will, in the end, have sat there essentially empty for well over an entire decade. And that, right there, is the sheer and the sobering scale of the true challenge of keeping our aging dams safe. And here is the really important thing to understand. Anderson Dam, as genuinely dramatic as it all is really not in the end some kind of a one-off, isolated case, because it is instead really just the single most extreme example of a very much broader challenge, one that is now facing the entire state of California, because California is a state that is fundamentally built upon a single deep tension, because on the one side it has a chronic and a steadily worsening thirst for water, with its very large population and its massive agricultural industry, and a climate that now swings violently back and forth between years of extreme and punishing drought and years of sudden and extreme flooding. And in order to try to manage all of that, it relies upon a truly vast network of dams and reservoirs, built to capture water during the wet years and then to store it away for all the dry ones. But on the other side, a great many of all of those very dams are now genuinely old, having been built many decades ago, and they all sit within one of the most earthquake-prone landscapes anywhere on the entire Earth. And so, all across California, these aging dams are now being very carefully re-examined, and in a whole number of cases, are now being operated at deliberately reduced levels for safety, or else are in genuine need of hugely expensive repairs and upgrades. And Anderson is simply the single largest and the single most urgent example of a challenge that now runs right through the entire heart of the state's water system. And it is worth zooming out even further than that too, because this is genuinely not only a California problem either, because right across the entire United States, there are now tens of thousands of dams that are decades and decades old, very many of them built, just like Anderson, in the great construction boom of the mid-20th century, and now steadily approaching, or already past, the end of their originally intended lifespans. And engineering assessments of the nation's overall infrastructure have, for many years now, consistently handed America's dams a genuinely poor grade, warning of a huge and a growing backlog of aging structures that are in real need of inspection, of repair, and of expensive modernization. Anderson, then, is not some strange, isolated outlier at all. It is really just the most dramatic and the most visible tip of a very large and a very quiet national iceberg. And California has, in fact already had one other very dramatic and a very public warning indeed, of exactly what can happen when an aging dam is finally pushed right to its limits. Because just a few short years ago, back in 2017, the main spillway of the tallest dam in all of America, the Great Oroville Dam up in Northern California, quite suddenly disintegrated during a period of very heavy water flows, ultimately forcing the emergency evacuation of very nearly 200,000 people, all living downstream. And that, too, went on to lead to a truly massive and a hugely expensive reconstruction effort. And so, together, Oroville and Anderson have now served as two absolutely enormous wake-up calls, reminding the entire state, in the very starkest possible terms, of just how very much genuinely depends upon the ongoing safety of all of this aging infrastructure. So let me end, as I always try to, with genuine honesty and with real balance. Because this is genuinely a story that it is very, very easy to badly misunderstand. So, first, and this is the single most important point of all, the near emptying of the Anderson Reservoir is genuinely not a sign of failure at all, nor of neglect. Because it is in fact very nearly the exact opposite of that. Because it is in truth a sign of the whole system, in a sense, actually working. Because the entire point of it is that engineers correctly identified a very serious risk before any disaster had actually happened, and then took decisive, if genuinely painful, action in order to prevent it. The dam is genuinely not cracking, and it is very much not about to simply collapse tomorrow. In fact, by deliberately keeping the reservoir nearly empty, the risk of any catastrophic failure has, in the meantime, been dramatically and hugely reduced. So this is, in truth, really a story of responsible dam safety in action, even if the true cost of that safety, measured in all that lost water and in many billions of dollars, is also genuinely enormous. And second, that cost is also very, very real indeed, and the trade-off involved is a genuinely painful one, because keeping a reservoir that could otherwise supply a full million people almost completely empty for well over a decade in a chronically drought-prone state is a genuinely serious sacrifice to have to make, and it has very real consequences for the whole region's water security. So this is in the end really not a simple or a happy story at all. It is instead a story about a genuinely and a painfully hard choice, one with no cost-free option available anywhere, and about a society ultimately choosing, quite correctly, to accept a large and a certain cost in order to avoid a much smaller chance of an absolutely unthinkable catastrophe. And third, the very deepest lesson in all of this is really one that applies very far beyond just California, because so very much of our entire modern world now quietly runs upon infrastructure that was in fact built many decades ago. All the dams and the bridges and the pipes and the power grids, so much of it now steadily aging, and so much of it originally built only to the lower safety standards and the very different assumptions of a much earlier time. And keeping all of it genuinely safe and properly up to date is a truly vast and an utterly relentless and an extraordinarily expensive ongoing task, and one that is so very, very easy for all of us to simply ignore, right up until the very moment that something finally goes wrong. And the story of Anderson Dam is, in a very real way, a near-perfect illustration of exactly that whole challenge, because it is the story of a state so utterly desperate for water that it has genuinely fought for every last available drop of it, and yet that then chose, quite deliberately, to give up one of its single greatest sources of that very water for well over a decade, simply because the only alternative was one that was far too dangerous to ever possibly accept. It is a story not of any carelessness at all, but rather of a genuinely hard and a deeply responsible choice. And it stands in the end as a powerful reminder that the great structures which we all build in order to protect us and to sustain us are genuinely not permanent and are genuinely not free, and that the work of keeping them all safe is a duty that quite simply never ever ends. So the very next time that you happen to hear all about some drought, about the reservoirs all running low, and about the desperate search for every last available drop of water, I really do hope that you'll pause and remember the genuinely strange case of the Anderson Dam. Remember that sometimes the very water that we all need so very badly is being held back from us not by any lack of rain at all, but rather by the simple aging concrete and earth of the very structures that we first built in order to store it. And remember, too, that behind the scenes, right across California, and indeed all around the entire world, there are engineers right now quietly making genuinely difficult and genuinely thankless decisions, carefully draining reservoirs and restricting old dams, and spending many billions on repairs, all of it purely in order to keep the rest of us safe from the kinds of disasters that we will, if only they all do their jobs well enough, thankfully never even have to see at all. Because the true story of our water is really not just ever a story about the rain and the rivers and the reservoirs alone, because it is also just as much a story about the enormous and the aging and the deeply human infrastructure that stands always between us and that water, and about the constant and the difficult and the never-ending work of somehow keeping all of that infrastructure from one day finally failing us, at the very